In the strange, sticky, and slightly unhinged world of 1990s American kids' cartoons, anything could happen, and often did. This was not just a colorful era filled with slapstick and sound effects. It was a full-blown golden age of animation where the boundaries of what was acceptable for children's television were constantly being tested, stretched, and, more often than not, gleefully ignored. Creators, many of whom had grown up on a diet of Looney Tunes chaos and underground comics, seemed to bypass the usual censors with a wink, a nudge, and a well-placed fart joke. They packed their shows with bizarre gags, grotesque close-ups, unsettling surrealism, and deeply questionable plot lines, all tucked neatly under the paper-thin excuse of being for kids. Cartoons in the 1990s were wild, unhinged, mentally deranged, so far out of their tree they'd left the forest completely behind. And God bless them for it. So how exactly did cartoons like Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, and Cow and Chicken manage to get away with so much under the radar? And why does it seem like today's cartoons are more cautious, polished, and heavily bubble-wrapped? To answer that, you have to understand the era in which these shows were made. The 1990s were weird, culturally chaotic in the best and worst ways. The U.S. was in transition, shifting away from the uptight conservatism of the 1980s and sliding into a more irreverent, ironic, and grungy state of mind. It was the decade of MTV's peak of Beavis and Butthead, of zines, rave flyers, and the rise of internet weirdness. This countercultural energy bled directly into television. Networks like Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network were just beginning to find their identity. They weren't yet global empires with multi-billion-dollar branding machines. They were scrappy, a little chaotic, and in desperate need of content to fill their endless programming blocks. This gave showrunners and animation studios a surprising amount of creative freedom. Freedom that would soon be lost to corporate consolidation and parental watchdog groups. At the time, the executives greenlighting these shows weren't micromanaging every frame. They didn't have 100 pages of brand guidelines or a focus group report for every character design. If a pitch was wild, weird, and just tame enough to technically count as safe for kids, it often got approved. The result? Creators ran wild. Writers, animators, and voice actors unleashed a wave of content that was brash, surreal, hyperactive, and often shockingly inappropriate by today's standards. Shows regularly pushed visual boundaries and moral lines with what felt like intentional audacity, an almost joyful lack of subtlety. Shows often pushed both visual boundaries and moral lines with an almost gleeful, anarchic disregard for subtlety, taste, or traditional expectations of what children's programming was supposed to be. These animated series thrived on shock value and absurdity, using slapstick, violence, gross-out gags, and exaggerated emotional breakdowns as a form of humor that felt unfiltered and wild. One of the most common and frankly bizarre recurring visual motifs was the use of comical nudity. Characters losing their clothes in ridiculous ways, often as the punchline to a scene or a moment of maximum humiliation. And this happened a lot. But if you start to really pay attention, a curious and very telling pattern emerges. This so-called comical nudity almost always involved male characters. You'd see Timmy Turner from The Fairly Odd Parents frantically covering himself with a conveniently placed object, Chester getting pantsed mid-sentence, or Mr. Crocker losing his dignity and his trousers in front of his students. In Ed, Edd, and Eddy, half an episode was devoted to Double D, the smartest of the group, performing a striptease in the middle of the street because of the effects of an enchanted boomerang. Someone had to animate that, and whoever did, wherever you are, I hope you talk to someone about all this. Anyway, in Codename Kids Next Door and Dexter's Laboratory, the male characters were often the ones left in the buff, whether by accident, clumsiness, or cosmic misfortune, with bare butts becoming visual gags. Torn pants, stolen towels, collapsing disguises. It all added up to a familiar trope. The goofy, mostly harmless male character losing his clothes in the name of comedy. Meanwhile, the female characters were handled with noticeably more restraint when it came to nudity or even physical comedy that involved their bodies in a vulnerable or exaggerated way. When female characters were involved in embarrassing situations, they were usually covered up, hidden behind objects, or styled in such a way that their anatomy was simplified to the point of near abstraction. It wasn't just modesty, it was near erasure. Think of characters like Mrs. Puff and Pearl in SpongeBob SquarePants, especially in surreal episodes like Feral Friends. Even when chaos reigned, their designs stayed static and safe, often resembling mannequin-like figures with no anatomical features to speak of. Their physical appearances were streamlined into inoffensive, sanitized versions of femininity, while the boys were free to flop, flail, and flash their animated backsides with abandon. Why the double standard? Why is it that in so many kids' cartoons, the boys can lose their clothes for laughs while the girls remain neatly covered, even in the most absurd situations? For one, it comes down to the deeply ingrained social taboo around female nudity. A taboo that has always been particularly strict in Western media, and especially so when the target audience is children. There's this unspoken, yet widely accepted notion that even in animated form, female nudity carries an inherent weight, a potential for being seen as sexual or inappropriate, even when it's presented in a completely non-sexual, comedic, or absurd context. So when a male character like Timmy Turner from The Fairly Odd Parents ends up naked because of a botched wish, it's played for laughs. He's embarrassed, sure, but the audience is meant to giggle. It's silly, harmless, even charming in its awkwardness. But if a female character were put in the exact same scenario, suddenly finding herself without clothes on screen, even for a second, the tone would shift dramatically. Animators and network executives start sweating. Parents raise eyebrows. People become uncomfortable. Not because the scene itself is any more explicit, but because of how differently we're conditioned to perceive female versus male vulnerability, especially when it comes to the body. That kind of discomfort is rooted in a long history of cultural and media double standards, where female bodies are policed more heavily and often linked by default to ideas of modesty, morality, or sexuality. Even in cartoons, which operate in a heightened, ridiculous reality, these societal rules tend to sneak in through the cracks. You'll notice that when nudity does occur in kids' shows, it's almost exclusively male characters who end up exposed. It becomes a running gag. The towel falls, the pants split, the wind blows just wrong, and suddenly a boy is standing there red-faced, clutching a conveniently placed object for modesty. It's a staple of cartoon slapstick. The joke depends on physicality, embarrassment, and the absurdity of the moment. But girl characters are almost never used in this way. They're spared the pantsing. They're kept just on the edge of the chaos. Then there's the humor itself, which reinforces the split. Boys in these shows are often written as lovable wrecking balls. They're loud, impulsive, chaotic, and constantly getting themselves into physical trouble. Whether it's Ed from Ed, Edd and Eddy crashing through a wall, or Billy from The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy sticking a fork in a light socket, their comedy is rooted in big, dumb energy. And with that energy comes a kind of cartoon invincibility. They can get blown up, squished, or end up naked. And it's all just part of the fun. Their bodies, like their brains, are punchlines. They're exaggerated, elastic, and expendable in the service of a joke. Slapstick thrives on the ridiculous treatment of male characters' physicality because there's less cultural baggage attached. Meanwhile, girl characters were often cast in the opposite role. They were the eye rollers, the problem solvers, the straight-laced foils to the boys' chaos. Think of characters like Lisa Simpson, Velma from Scooby-Doo, or Susie Carmichael from Rugrats. Even when they were central to the story, they were usually portrayed as more competent, more serious, and less likely to be physically humiliated. It wasn't that they couldn't be funny, but the kind of humor they were allowed was different. Clever, witty, sarcastic, but rarely slapstick, and almost never the kind that would leave them stripped down and scrambling for cover. The idea of subjecting a girl character to the same ridiculous bodily humor as a boy character didn't fit the mold networks had built, consciously or not. Outside of nudity, the 1990s also served up an unrelenting parade of how in the world did they get away with that? Moments that still baffle anyone revisiting these shows today. This was a time when children's cartoons regularly slipped in content that by today's standards would be met with immediate outrage, think pieces, and probably a few panicked press releases from the network. Take Rocko's Modern Life, for instance. A show that, from the very first episodes of its original airing in September 1993, wore its perverseness clearly on its sleeve. One example came in the second episode of the first season named Canned, where Rocko, The main character, in his attempt to get a job, ends up working at a phone sex hotline. Yes, in a children's show, referred to as a specialty phone operator. Rocko's partition has a memo taped to it which says, "Be hot, be naughty, be courteous," while fielding calls from clients who moaned things like, "Oh baby, oh baby, oh baby," before his neighbor Mrs. Bighead picked up and declared a confused and embarrassed, "Rocko," before both of them slammed the phones down awkwardly. Speaking of Rocko's neighbor, 4 episodes later, in episode 6, Leapfrogs, Mrs. Bighead, feeling she doesn't get enough bedroom attention from her husband, eyes up Rocko as a potential stand-in. Therefore, she spends the entire episode trying to seduce him into having an affair with her, including, but not limited to, zipping the zipper of her red dress in a lewd manner and inviting him into her bedroom and asking him what he likes about her physically so as to have one thing lead to another. Though Rocko, in his naivety, doesn't fall for any of them. Despite the sexual undertones of this episode being about as subtle as a brick to the face, rumors circulated for years that this episode was banned after 2 airings. But, to the surprise of many, it actually remained in syndication up until January 1997, and has been in rotation and streaming availability at various times ever since, which is great if you want to introduce your 7-year-old children to the concept of adultery. And need we forget the No Tell Motel? Appearing only once in Season 2, Episode 4, Road Rash. Just the name alone speaks volumes. Rocko and Heifer are on a road trip, but need a place to stay for the night, where, after avoiding the infamous Bates Motel, they come across the No Tell Motel, a business that charges room rates by the minute, let alone the hour. Aside from the fact that it is more than obvious that this is one of those sleazy roadside motels frequented by prostitutes, and that the concierge matches many of the ethnic stereotypes who are often manning the desks of such places, the fact that he literally tells them that there has been a premature departure, thus freeing up a room for them, and questions with incredulity that Rocko and Heifer are going to spend all night inside the room, whistling with amazement at their stamina, truly is the cherry on the top of this carnal cupcake. Yikes! Who, in the deepest, darkest recesses of Nickelodeon studios, sat there in broad daylight and said, "Let's get that one out there." And that was just the beginning. Death wasn't a distant theme, it was often a central character. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy featured the literal Grim Reaper as a comedic lead who hung out with children. In other shows, characters vomited on command, got dismembered with cartoonish glee, and suffered every manner of grotesque injury imaginable. Going to hell wasn't off the table either. Shows casually sent characters to the underworld, met satanic creatures, or made light of damnation with disturbing regularity. Some characters turned into zombies, others were hunted like prey, crushed under massive objects, or blown to smithereens in ways that would make Wile E. Coyote look tame. It was chaos. It was absurd. And incredibly, it was often slapped with a TVY7 rating, meaning it was considered appropriate for children as young as 7. That rating somehow covered reapers, gore, bodily fluids, psychological horror, and surreal violence, all under the guise of slapstick or absurdist comedy. It's almost hard to believe now, but back then, these moments were simply part of after-school programming. Parents might have walked by the TV, glanced at the screen, and shrugged, assuming it was just harmless animation. But for the kids watching, these shows burned unforgettable images into their developing brains, images that made them laugh, squirm, or sit in stunned confusion. Regulations at the time were so much looser, not non-existent, not completely negligent, but far from the tightly controlled, hyper-sanitized oversight we see in much of children's programming today. The watchdogs weren't exactly asleep at the wheel, but they also weren't panicking over every fart joke, every splash of exaggerated cartoon violence, or every line of suggestive dialogue that might have hinted at something more adult. Standards and practices, the internal censors responsible for making sure shows didn't cross the line, were present, but their definition of the line was much fuzzier, and they often gave creators the benefit of the doubt. It was a window of opportunity, a loophole in the cultural timeline. Networks like Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon were still in their early stages of building an identity, and because they didn't yet have decades of tradition or massive parent-led pressure campaigns hanging over them, there was more room to push boundaries, experiment wildly, and see what stuck. With cable TV still expanding and trying to capture as much market share as possible, executives were far more concerned about capturing eyeballs than about upholding moral standards or avoiding controversy. In many cases, weird or provocative content was the draw. And what did that freedom actually look like when it played out on screen? Perhaps the most demented of them all was Cow and Chicken. The very premise was absurd on a cellular level. Two siblings, a cow and a chicken, somehow born from a pair of human parents who were only ever shown from the waist down. The show never explained how this family setup worked, and it didn't need to. That was the point. Surreal, nonsensical world building was part of the joke. The red guy, who served as the show's chaotic pseudo-antagonist, was basically the devil reimagined as a flamboyant, naked weirdo with a bright red butt, constantly slipping into ridiculous disguises, cross-dressing outfits, or outright madness. As if to draw deliberate attention to his bottomless state, the red guy's various permutations would be accompanied by humorous names that highlighted his lack of anything below the belt, with names including, but not limited to, Dr. Lax Slacks, Uncle Breezybum, Baron von Nine Lederhosen, Ivan and Ben Panst Heine, Al Heine, Mrs. Bear Derriere, Geraldo Rear Viewer, Officer Pansovsky, Mr. Rumstein, Officer Dr. and Principal Heine, Major Wedgie, Heine Bow, Mr. Bumby Shone, Lance Sackless, both Colonel and Professor Heine Bottom, Captain Butt, Seriously, Dr. Van Smelsing, No Pants de Leon, The Great Pansini, Cleo Pantless, Louis B. Bear, Mr. Slacksoff, Larry Lackapants, Captain Butts Pirate, Mr. Jeans Begone, and Tawny Tukas. Honestly, whoever came up with all those names needs both a medal and a trip to the psychologist. Then there was I Am Weasel, a spin-off that somehow managed to be even weirder. It followed the heroic, too perfect I Am Weasel and his dim-witted rival, I.R. Baboon, whose only consistent dialogue was shouting, I are smart, while causing total mayhem. These episodes weren't about coherent stories or emotional arcs. They were about letting loose, about dropping the audience into a world with no rules, no logic, just madness disguised as humor. There was no attempt to moralize. These shows didn't teach lessons. They didn't hold hands or sugarcoat anything. What they offered instead was pure, beautiful, greasy chaos. Cartoons as absurdist performance art. These shows were loud, fast, and gleefully inappropriate in a way that would be nearly impossible to greenlight today. This wasn't limited to one channel or one show. Elsewhere, Animaniacs was delivering high-speed, high-IQ satire packed with references to everything from Karl Marx to the Goodfellas to William Shakespeare, all delivered with Looney Tunes slapstick energy and a wink toward the adults in the room. But at the time, it just aired. No one batted an eye. Ren and Stimpy, meanwhile, was on another plane entirely. That show wasn't just edgy, it was disturbing. It featured grotesque close-ups, warped facial expressions, and body horror that would give most horror filmmakers pause. Nerve endings were yanked out, teeth fell out of heads, eyeballs oozed, and skin peeled off like old wallpaper. It wasn't just boundary pushing, it gleefully leapt over every line. But what's often lost in the retelling is that this wasn't just gross out for its own sake. Beneath the slime and screams, there was actual artistry at work. The animation styles in these shows were deliberate, bold, messy in a way that felt alive. Lines weren't always clean. Color palettes clashed. Backgrounds were bizarrely detailed or eerily empty. These weren't aesthetic accidents. They were choices that told you what kind of world you were watching. The characters didn't need to be cute. In fact, cuteness was usually beside the point. What mattered was memorability. What mattered was tone. You weren't meant to feel safe and cozy. You were meant to feel like anything could happen, because it probably would. Today, the landscape of children's animation has become far more controlled, calculated, and cautious than it was just a couple of decades ago. Things have tightened up across the board. Parents are no longer just passive consumers who catch glimpses of what their kids are watching. They're online, hyper-aware, and deeply involved in monitoring media. They're on forums, reading think pieces, writing reviews, and ready to raise a digital pitchfork the moment something seems inappropriate or offensive. A single scene or line of dialogue can spark outrage on social media and balloon into a viral controversy within hours. Networks and studios, fully aware of how quickly backlash can spread, often operate in damage control mode before a problem even arises. Their solution? Stick to safe. Stay within the lines. Don't rock the boat. Corporations, which now own most of the major studios producing animated content, are acutely tuned in to brand image and consumer sentiment. They're not just selling shows, they're selling merchandise, theme park tickets, streaming subscriptions, and brand loyalty. The The stakes are higher, and that means risk-taking is lower. There's a tendency to aim for a broader, more sanitized appeal, something that won't offend anyone, won't raise eyebrows, and definitely won't get any angry emails from concerned mom blogs or viral call-out threads on Twitter and TikTok. At the same time, not everything that the showrunners attempted to slip under the radar in the 1990s got passed without landing them in a whole mess of controversy. Even the seemingly unbridled madness of Cow and Chicken did get a little too real and pushed itself a little too much into bad taste. For instance, the episode Buffalo Gals aired only once before being banned due to its sexual overtones being so far from subtle that they might as well have literally come out and said it. The episode focused on Cow and Chicken's home being invaded by a biker gang of women named the Buffalo Gals, who promptly start chewing on their carpets. Not only did the design of these women obviously match the stereotypes of butch lesbians, but their practice of chewing carpets was essentially a visualization for a euphemism for a certain type of lovemaking act lesbian women perform, especially on those who neglect to wax or shave, down there. Either way, the banning of this episode, alongside other episodes that similarly pushed the boat out just a little too far, demonstrated that even in the seemingly limitless potential of the uncensored 1990s, there was pushback and there could be consequences. As such, many showrunners and studios found that the balance between inputting money, time, and resources into an episode that was deliberately provocative, and then having all that go up in smoke when the censors banned it after one showing, was simply too much of a pain to manage. And though gross or strange things did continue into the 2000s, the line was definitely more clearly defined as to what could be shown on children's television and what would have to remain either on the cutting room floor or in the fevered imagination of the writers and animators. Or if it was for kids, it would be left behind in the original Japanese version. But that's another story. That said, modern cartoons aren't completely toothless. Far from it. There are still creators pushing boundaries in quieter, more emotionally nuanced ways. Shows like The Owl House, Infinity Train, and Adventure Time have managed to carve out space for dark themes, complicated relationships, and meaningful character development. They deal with grief, trauma, identity, and existential dread, all wrapped in colorful, often whimsical animation. The writing is sharp, the world building is deep, and the storytelling is often far more mature than anything that aired during the so-called golden age of 90s weirdness. But these shows approach danger and complexity with careful intention. They feel curated, like art house projects within the bounds of corporate safety nets. What's harder to find today is the gleeful, chaotic, and downright disgusting energy that defines so much of 90s cartoon culture. The kind of storytelling that didn't just tiptoe toward the edge, it cannonballed off it. Shows back then weren't afraid to be gross, irreverent, and totally absurd. They leaned into their weirdness. They didn't always make sense, and they didn't care if they disturbed you a little. That raw, rebellious spirit, the sense that anything could happen, and often did, is largely missing from today's lineup. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe we've outgrown that particular brand of chaos, or maybe not. For the kids who grew up watching animated shows filled with naked butts, farting aliens, talking food, and haunted outhouses, there's a strange nostalgia tied to that era. Those cartoons weren't just entertainment. They were permission to be weird, to laugh at the grotesque, and to revel in the absurdity of it all. They reflected a world where things didn't always make sense, and where silliness didn't have to be justified. And let's be honest with ourselves, most of us didn't fully grasp how wild those shows really were until we revisited them as adults. Watching them now, with grown-up eyes, it's like uncovering a hidden layer of madness we were too young to notice. The innuendos, the visual gags, the low-level psychological horror. How did this air on Saturday morning TV? And yet, it did. And it left its mark on an entire generation of kids who grew up with a warped sense of humor and a deep appreciation for the absurd.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199X, we're here just for you, for you.